books did you read last year? Well, I may have read too many, but I thought it might be fun to share some of my favorites from the first half of this year with you today. I have been a reader since before I could officially read. I would read books that I had memorized when I was really young. I loved to listen to what at the time were called Super Scope Storyteller Presents. And they were books on cassette that I would listen to over and over. And they had this chime when you would turn the page so that as a young learning reader, you could read along and you would know exactly when to turn the page. Oh, I have fond memories of those books. I am still a huge audiobook listener to this day. In fact, almost all of the books that I listen to are audiobooks these days. I'm an audio learner, and it just works as a really good medium for me because I can listen to books while I'm doing other things like commuting to work or cleaning house or getting ready for bed. And I love that I get to have that time to do that. Doing something while I'm listening to an audiobook helps me to really focus in and listen to the words of it a little bit better. So I'm a huge fan. Maybe you are too. Well, last year I read 200 books. Now, I'm not quite on track to do that many this year, but who knows? We'll see. I am still a big reader, and I wanted to share some of my favorite reads with you today. Have you ever heard the adage that writers are readers? I think for me that is definitely true. That the reason I think I'm a writer is because I love to read so much. And I've found so much joy in books over the years. So this year, of course, I've been reading, and I thought I would share a few of my favorites with you. Because I keep track of the books that I read, I know that about 2/3 of the books that I read are fiction, and about 1/3 of the books that I read are nonfiction. I really love nonfiction, but I read it much slower than I read a fiction book. Sometimes in fiction books, I just want a really nice escape and a quick read. Often in nonfiction books, I'm looking for information or some kind of learning. And so I approach those genres differently. My very favorite genre has to be the cozy mystery. I'm not into gory or gruesome mysteries, and I don't like psychological thrillers that hype me up because I'm usually reading right before bed. But cozy mysteries seem to be the sweet spot for me. What is your favorite genre to read? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at some of my favorite reads this year. Well, this January, I read 14 books, and 9 of those were fiction. And one of the great surprises of January was discovering a trilogy called The Inheritance Games. This was a really fun kind of mystery. I think it's classified as young adult, but it was just a fun read full of puzzles. It was full of interesting twists and quirky characters. I like both. In February, I read 11 books. 6 of those were fiction and 5 of those were nonfiction. And my most exciting read of February was a nonfiction book by an author that I had never read before, but who was recommended to me. The book is called Waymaker, and it's written by Anne Voskamp. I've since read a couple other of her books and enjoyed those just as well, but this was one that is beautifully written, it is amazingly narrated, and it is profoundly thought-provoking. I spent a lot of time mulling this one over. It was a slow read for me. It wasn't one that I could read a large chunk of at a time because I really wanted to be able to savor the thoughts around her ideas. It's a fabulous book, and I would definitely recommend it. In March, I read 12 books, and they were evenly divided between fiction and nonfiction. And it was apparently a pretty good reading month because I marked 3 of them as being really good reads. 2 of them were nonfiction. One of those books was called Switch, and it was a really helpful book on using behavioral techniques to change things in your life. I teach this in my program, so it was applicable there. It was also personally applicable, and I just really enjoyed reading it. The authors of that book were also a first for me, so I really enjoyed being able to discover another new author. The other nonfiction book that I really enjoyed was a highly anticipated book by Charles Duhigg called Super Communicators. And it was just chock full of knowledge about the topic of communication. So again, one that I really enjoyed because of my profession, but I also enjoyed applying it personally. Well, speaking of personal, one of my guilty pleasures is watching many seasons of The Bachelor. I don't know why that show grips me like it does, but I am absolutely fascinated at the idea of people being willing to go on TV in very improbable circumstances and look for a lasting relationship, especially since it's got years of history of not working. I find the whole thing incredibly intriguing. And because I like that show, one of the fiction books that I really enjoyed reading was called One to Watch. And it's basically a novel set in a reality TV show, much like The Bachelor. It was just a fun, light, easy read, but it's certainly one that I enjoyed. So one of the things that I really enjoy doing is grouping my reading in themes. You know, at certain times of the year, you feel more like reading certain types of novels. And in January and February especially, I was really wanting to read or reread some of C.S. Lewis's works. I've read most of what he has written. I've taken a college course on C.S. Lewis. He is probably at the tip top of my favorite authors list. And I just enjoyed being able to review his work again. And another author that I wanted to make a point of reading was Andrew McCarthy. I had never read any of his fiction. I had followed him as an actor back in the 80s, and he had a memoir coming out that I was interested in reading. And so it seemed like a good time to pair that with some of his fiction, which I also enjoyed reading, and another one of his memoirs. So that brings us to April. In April, I read 15 books. 10 of them were fiction and 5 were nonfiction. And in the month of April, out of those 15 books, 3 of them were ones that I really wanted to highlight. One was a very short book that I read. It was like a 45-minute audio book, but it was pretty profound for seeing my work as an artist, both as an artist who writes and as an artist who creates videos. And it was pretty inspiring for me. Just a little thin book called Art Matters. I also read the book 1000 Gifts, also by Anne Voskamp, and it was just as good as Waymaker. Also just reminded me of the importance of gratitude and how life-changing that one thing can be. She is an impressive writer. So the fiction read that I really enjoyed in April was called The Printed Letter Bookshop. And it is a sweet, poignant book about 3 women grieving the passing of another and their stories and how they intertwined. So in the month of May, I read 15 books, and in this month, the majority were nonfiction. So 8 nonfiction and 7 fiction books. And out of those, I had 3 that were real standouts to me, all of them nonfiction. So the first one was one that I will give a shout out to my nephew. He wrote and published his first book, and I got to be one of the beta readers for it. And it is an impressive book for young high school students. The book is called From Hidden to Finals, and it is a description of ways to be successful in public speaking and debate. He has been incredibly successful himself in those areas, and the book is really well written by a very impressive young adult. If you have young people in your life that are interested in being successful, this book will help them to present themselves in a way that looks confident, poised, and successful. The other two books that I really enjoyed in May were both written by Ruth Reichel, and this was my first experience reading her, and I have to say it will not be the last. I've got several more of hers on my TBR list because these books were outstanding. So the first one of her books that I read was called Garlic and Sapphires, and it's a memoir of her as a food critic in New York City and how she would put on disguises so she wouldn't be found out, and it is a delightful read. She writes about food in amazing ways that aren't pretentious, and I loved the wit of the books. I loved the story of the memoir, and I just truly learned to appreciate her particular style of writing. And so I read another one, and it was also a memoir called For You, Mom, Finally. And as a person who works in a profession of relationships, this book was one that really explored the mother-daughter relationship in a beautiful but complicated and complex way. And I, again, just thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt like I was right there as a witness to her story. And it also is filled with those descriptions that made me appreciate her writing in the first place. And in June, I went on a writing spree and read 21 books. 16 of those were fiction and 5 were nonfiction, and my favorites were both out of the nonfiction category. The first one was called He Speaks into the Silence, and the second one was How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. Now, this book is a classic. It's an old Dale Carnegie book that I had never read. I've read How to Win Friends and Influence People many years ago, but I had never read this book. And I have to say that I actually thought it was really applicable for right now. Part of the fun of reading it is that it was written back in the 30s, and so many of the illustrations were quite dated, post-Depression era, and yet, as he talked about suicide and depression and shutting down in life, I couldn't help but think that those issues are absolutely as relevant today as they were then. So it was really fun to go and read an older version of a book about something that is still a very current problem. And I have to say, I left with several strategies that I have used almost daily since. I'm not a tremendous worrier, but I am always thinking about the future and kind of anticipating things, which is what breeds anxiety. And his strategy of containing today was one of my favorites in the entire book. But you're going to have to read it to learn more about that strategy. I just realized that I overlooked 2 fiction books that I really did enjoy in the month of June. One was called Something Fresh, and the other was called Love That Dog. Love That Dog is a children's book, but I added it to my list. I don't usually record those kind of books, but I did in this case because it's one that I wanted to remember, and it's one that I want to include with my kids in our homeschool curriculum in the fall. It is a book about a young boy who is learning to write poetry, and it's written beautifully, and it's tender and sweet, and it does a lovely job of capturing the emotions of being nervous about your writing, nervous about other people reading your writing and knowing that it was yours, and it's just a lovely read. I think all writers could benefit from reading that book, so I included it on the list too. Love That Dog. If you are a writer, you need to be reading books on writing, but you also need to read books in the genre that you like to write. In addition to that, I think it's tremendously helpful to read books that aren't either of those because they give you inspiration and they help you put things together in new and interesting ways because you're exposing yourself to things outside of that category that you like to write in. But what if you aren't a reader? What if it's difficult for you to read books? Well, I have a couple of suggestions for you. One is, instead of physically reading books, maybe audiobooks would work for you. For those of us that are audio learners, that's kind of a no-brainer. I recognize that not everyone is, but these days, some of the narrations in the books are so amazing. And sometimes they're full theatrical productions. So maybe engaging with reading through a different medium might be something that's helpful. But here's an even better tip. Could you spare 10 to 15 minutes either in the morning or in the evening before you go to bed? If you could do that every day, just a small shift, a small little habit that you cultivate, that would turn into reading 10 to 12 books a year. That's how easy it is. So we can apply that tortoise habit even to reading. However you read your books, I hope that you get as much joy from them as I do. So there's a peek into what I read. You know about how I write. So now it's your turn. So out of the first half of the year, those are some of my favorite reads. And if writers are also readers, perhaps there's a book on that list that you might be interested in reading too. If you like this kind of video, it's different from what I typically do, let me know and I might create another one for the second half of the year. Either way, I'd love to know what your favorite books are because I am always looking for more books to read. Happy reading and happy writing.